Okay guys, it's Mr. Duncan, and tonight our presentation will be on the Dark Ages, or the time before the rebirth of learning, known as the Renaissance in Europe. Now, for this presentation, I want you to watch it, and I want you to take notes in your notebook. Remember, we're using our Cornell note-taking system, so I want you to write down the most important information in your own words. Don't just copy my notes. I want you to write down 3 questions that you have from this information. And lastly, I want you to write down a summary sentence, where if someone said, "Hey, what's the presentation about?" you could say, "It's about this," in one sentence. And for extra respect, I want you to tell me what the 3 pictures are that you're looking at on this slide. Okay, so let's begin with this question. Why were the Dark Ages so dark? Now, the Dark Ages are dark because of 3 reasons. We begin with the fact that it simply wasn't Rome. I'm not talking about Rome, Georgia, my hometown. I'm talking about the Roman Empire. What do you think of when someone mentions the Roman Empire? Exactly. You think of colosseums, you think of gladiators, you think of a huge empire that unified thousands and thousands of people. Now, after the fall of Rome, you have a period called the Dark Ages. Now, with this period, things get smaller. Trade breaks down. And if people aren't trading, then cities start to break down and people start to live much, much simpler. So instead of big cities, people start to live in towns and in even smaller places called villages. Now, as we'll talk about, in villages, people are living more of a farming lifestyle than an urban lifestyle that people used to live in the Roman Empire. Now, during this time period, people had to prioritize their life. Now, if it meant farming to produce more food, to survive the winter, to live for one more year, or going to school to learn information, and then probably dying because you don't have enough food to survive, people would always choose to farm. And so as a result, learning begins to decline. Going along with this, unifying languages like Latin also decline because people start to live more locally. Now, instead of a language like Latin, which is considered a dead language today, you start to see the build-up and development of more local languages that we hear today, like Spanish and Portuguese and German and French and English. So some would say this is a good thing today. However, at the time, in the Dark Ages, it was a bad thing because people began to live more isolated lives. Now, the last thing in this category that the Romans would never do is when it comes to how justice is served. Let's say you break a law. The Romans wrote these laws down for people to see. And if you were accused of breaking a law, you would go to a trial. You get to present your case, your information. And there would be a judge and probably a jury who would say if you were innocent or guilty. In the Dark Ages, in these small villages, people aren't administering justice this way. Instead, it's based on local customs like the ordeals. Ordeals are like dares or extreme tests to see if someone is guilty or not. And it's basically something like they throw you into a cold river and see if you survive. Or they put a rock in a really hot pot of water. Then you have to hold the rock in your hand for a minute and see if your skin blisters. And so with this, you see that all civilization really starts to go away and people really begin to live like barbarians again. So when we're looking at this period, the Dark Ages, think about what the Roman life was like, and now completely reverse it. This is the anti-Rome. People are barbarians again. Okay, beyond the fact that it simply wasn't Rome, the Dark Ages are also very dark because this is a very dangerous time and place to live. Simply put, there is danger from criminals, there is danger from invaders, there's danger from Europeans invading other places, and lastly, there's danger from different kingdoms within Europe fighting against each other. Now, starting with the criminals, the outlaws. As we said earlier, when trade breaks down and cities get more local and living gets more dangerous and more difficult, people turn to desperate acts. And this includes stealing people's possessions and money. It includes committing terrible acts like murder. And so life just becomes a very dangerous place during this time period in Europe. Now, going a step further, you have groups of people from the outside of Europe who want to come into Europe and gain land, to gain possessions, to gain power. This includes people from the north, the Vikings, people from the Middle East and North Africa, the Muslims, and people from the east part of Europe, most notably a group of Hungarians called the Magyars. Now, in addition to this, you have Europeans who are leaving Europe to attack other places outside of Europe. This includes the Crusades, when Christian knights left Europe to retake the Holy Land from the Muslims, hoping to gain control of the holy city of Jerusalem. And then lastly, you have a civil war of sorts in Europe. And what I mean by that is you have two member states, England and France, that fight in something called the 100 Years' War. Quick question, how long did the 100 Years' War last? Exactly, 116 years. It doesn't make sense to me either. And so people in England were going to France to fight to win land and win possessions and power that the English kings had traditionally held in the territory of France. So to sum up, you have thieves creating a dangerous environment. You have invaders creating a dangerous environment. You have European invaders invading other places creating a dangerous environment. And lastly, you have kingdoms fighting each other within Europe, creating yet another dangerous environment. And finally, life was simply tough. People are living farm lives, and as you know, farming is very unpredictable. It's all about the soil. It's all about the weather. If you have bad weather, then maybe you don't survive, because after you harvest, you need enough food to make it through a very long and tough winter. And so this is a very unpredictable environment. Peasants had to work for themselves. They had to work for their lords in the feudal system called feudalism. They got protection from that, but they also had to give service. So that meant they're working 6 days a week. However, only 3 days a week of that work is actually on their own land. So the other 3 days they're working for someone else. Again, that seems to be tough. If you can imagine working a summer job and 3 days a week you get to keep your salary, the other 3 days a week you work, you give it to someone else. And lastly, but certainly not leastly, the diseases of the Middle Ages and Dark Ages tore entire societies apart. These diseases come from, in some cases, overpopulation. It comes from trade. It comes from a lack of cleanliness and hygiene. And the most famous of these, as you know, was the Black Death, or the bubonic plague. Now, the only source of hope during this time period was the church. The Christian church in Rome, Italy, was the only unifying factor, because people could not be united by kingdoms any longer like the Roman Empire had. And so instead, the church is the only source of stability. The Pope, as a result, becomes more powerful than kings during this time period. Now, the Christian church, if you were living in a village, would have a very big presence because it provided really everything you needed to live. It provided schools, it provided hospital care and doctor services. This is where obviously you went to church, and it's where you heard the Bible read to you and interpreted for you. It's also the main building in your little village. So anytime there's a gathering, such as a dance or a trade fair where people bring their things to sell, or a meeting, it always happened at the church. So without the church, the Dark Ages would be even darker, if you can imagine. So really the only thing that kept hope alive was the Christian church. And so the Dark Ages, as we've talked about, are dark because A, it isn't Rome, B, life is dangerous, and C, life is tough. Thank you very much, and remember, I want you to interpret the 3 pictures on the first slide. See you tomorrow.